Um, My name is Antje Petty. I'm with the Max Card Institute for German American Studies here at the University in Wisconsin and Madison. Welcome everyone from around the country and the globe. And yeah, we are really delighted that you join us tonight for this presentation by Dr. Emily Sneff, actually her second presentation in the Max Card Institute's lecture series. And it's titled German Americans and the Founding of the United States. Our program tonight is a collaboration of the Max Card Institute and the German Society of Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, as well as the German Historical Institute in Washington, D.C. And it is supported by the Friends of the Max Card Institute. Dr. Sneff's presentation tonight will be moderated by Bettina Hess from the German Society of Pennsylvania and Jana Dunskeck from the German Historical Institute. And now, I will hand things over to Bettina and Jana and Emily. I will mute myself, close my video, but I will hear in the background, and if there are any questions, I'm here. Enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Antje, for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jana Keck, and I'm a research fellow at the German Historical Institute in Washington, short GHI. The GHI is an internationally renowned center for advanced historical research with offices in Washington, D.C. and Berkeley, California. For decades, the GHI has played a leading role in the study of German American and transatlantic history, exploring how migration, war, political change, and cultural exchange have shaped both Europe and the Americas, including, for instance, the flagship digital project, Migrant Connections, which collects, digitizes, and makes accessible thousands of letters sent from German-speaking Europe to the Americas, to German Americans in the 19th and 20th centuries. If you are interested in contributing, especially by helping transcribe letters written in the German script, we warmly encourage you to visit the project website, migrantconnections.org, and get in touch with us. I'm looking forward to Emily's lecture tonight and, of course, the discussion with you afterwards. And now I'm handing over to Bettina Hess, who will introduce our speaker.
Great, thank you, Jana. First, I will introduce my institution briefly. My name is Bettina Hess. I'm the librarian at the German Society of Pennsylvania. As Antje mentioned, we're in Philadelphia. The German Society was founded in 1764 to aid newly arrived German-speaking immigrants to Philadelphia. And the library was established in 1817 for the use of its members, but has since become a research institution, research library that's used by scholars, genealogists, and anyone who's interested in German or German American history. In addition to the Society's own records dating back to the founding, we have records of other German organizations and individuals, mostly from Philadelphia, and a lot of printed and manuscript material documenting the German experience in the Americas. The library is open to the public 2 days a week. It's open to researchers, visitors, for tours. Email me if you're interested in coming by or learning more about what we have in our collection. You can also go to our website and learn, visit our online catalog and find out about our programs, join the mailing list, and find out everything you want to know about the German Society. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Emily Sneff. Dr. Sneff is an early American historian and a leading expert on the Declaration of Independence. She received her MA and PhD in history from the College of William and Mary, and she's the consulting curator for exhibitions around the Semiquincentennial, including the Declaration's Journey at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, and Window to Revolution, Pennsylvania Germans and the War for Independence at Historic Trappe, also in PA. Her book, When the Declaration of Independence Was News, is going to be published in April with Oxford University Press. And now I'm going to turn it over to Emily.
Great. Thank you, Bettina, and thank you, Jana and Antje, for your introductions as well. I'm so pleased to be with all of you this evening, and I'm going to begin by talking about two statues. I wanted to start with something that represented the people that we're talking about. And in the work that I do for museums, last presentation that I gave, I focused on the Museum of the American Revolution and the stories that we're telling in the Declaration's journey. And today, you'll get a bit of my experience working with Historic Trappe, which is home to the Muhlenberg family. So let's go back to 1878, when a commission was appointed to select two Pennsylvanians to be honored with statues in the US Capitol. And this commission decided on Robert Fulton, who you can see on the left, and Peter Muhlenberg, who you can see on the right. And these remain the statues representing Pennsylvania to this day. These men were contemporaries. Fulton lived from 1765 to 1815, and Muhlenberg lived from 1747 to 1807. Fulton is remembered for his engineering abilities, and specifically the first commercially successful steamboat. You can see him fiddling with a model on his lap there. Muhlenberg is remembered for his military leadership, and unlike Fulton, he actually served in Congress. So we have the scientist and the soldier statesman. Muhlenberg's statue was crafted by a female sculptor, Blanche Nevin, and installed in 1889 at the Capitol. And Peter Muhlenberg is shown here in the middle of removing his clerical robe to reveal his military uniform underneath. And this is an event that has been highly mythologized, but we know for a fact that if it happened in Virginia at his congregation in Woodstock, and not in Pennsylvania. And so Muhlenberg's statue actually becomes a subject of debate in newspapers from 1878 when he's first chosen, all the way through 1889 when he is revealed. And there's aesthetic complaints once the statue is unveiled. Some newspapers describe him as the little sprinter because his statue was kind of diminutive compared to the others in the Capitol, and he looks like he's mid-run the way that his feet are positioned. But there's a bigger issue than that. And the question really was whether Muhlenberg was Pennsylvanian enough to be one of these two representatives in the US Capitol. So his time spent in Virginia was a touchy subject. An article in the Lancaster Intelligencer in 1878 ran through some of the other better options. Benjamin Franklin, of course, but he wasn't born in Pennsylvania, so that technically ruled him out. Neither was Robert Morris. He was born in England, and also he had not supported the Declaration of Independence, though he did still sign it, so there was a sort of old wound there that they didn't want to open by selecting him. Anthony Wayne was seen as the obvious pick, that if you wanted a Continental Army officer to represent Pennsylvania's sort of military during the American Revolution, Wayne was the much better choice. Now that can be debated, but that was sort of the consensus in the newspapers. And multiple newspapers actually referred to the choice of Muhlenberg over Wayne as a, quote, blunder. But there is an undercurrent in this newspaper reporting about whether Muhlenberg's statue was a good choice or not. And it goes back to this belief that he was special because he was German, that he was only picked because he represented the German population of Pennsylvania. This othering and critiquing of German Americans goes back through time. And as we'll see this evening, at the founding of the United States, there was a sense that German Americans were a distinct political group, that they operated as a bloc, and that they could be treated as sort of one perspective. And that was certainly not the case. This also means that German Americans are often discounted when we think about the founders. The sort of list of founding fathers that is often rattled off does not include any German names. And in fact, some of the men we typically think of as founding fathers had a negative perspective on German Americans when it came to politics. Benjamin Franklin's failed attempts to launch a German newspaper and his overall wariness of German immigrants are pretty well known. Interestingly, John Adams kind of blamed the Germans for his political downfall, losing the presidency and the fall of the Federalist Party. Later in life, he reflected back on his political career, and he described the Germans as, quote, ignorant of our language as they were of our laws. Interesting use of our there. And Adams also believed that if he had just appointed one of the Muhlenbergs to a particular political office, that would have swayed things in his favor, and the Germans would, quote, have been gratified with appointments of these their leaders, and the election in Pennsylvania would have gone for his party, the Federalists. So there's this bitterness and this perception towards Germans that everyone who's ethnically German is going to vote a certain way, have a certain political perspective, and can be represented by a single individual like Peter Muhlenberg, whether that's in the 1790s, 1800s, or into the 1880s with this statue. So the reality is that there were far more German Americans than just Peter Muhlenberg, although he will get his due this evening. In 1776, at the time of the Declaration of Independence, there were about 250,000 people of German ethnicity in the colonies that became the United States. That population grew by the time that the Constitution was ratified, and that also meant that the number of German newspapers, pamphlets, books, all increased, and eventually the number of German Americans in high-ranking military and political positions increased as well. These people represent only a fraction of a much larger whole, not all of whom were politically engaged, either by choice or by right, thinking about women. When we also think about this sort of block of German Americans, this is an immigrant community, or rather immigrant communities spread out all over the United States who have different religions, different perspectives on war, on slaveholding, on education, on language. So there's quite a bit of diversity among these people of German heritage. So this evening, as we talk about German Americans and the founding of the United States, remember that this is representative rather than comprehensive. It would be impossible for me to give a full history of all of the German Americans involved in the founding of the United States writ large. As those of you who joined my last presentation in November know, my particular expertise is in the Declaration of Independence. So chances are that if you ask me about a specific individual's impact, I might not be the best person to give an answer. But if you have any particular people who you want to recognize, feel free to add them in the chat as we go along, and that can create a conversation so that we all learn about more German Americans at the founding. So this presentation is broken up into roughly 3 parts: soldiers, statesmen, and then one particular family. To begin with the soldiers, there are many different men who were involved in the Revolutionary War. There were several entirely German battalions, including one which was recruited from Maryland and Pennsylvania in the summer of 1776. It's actually something that some of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were writing about and actively involved in on July 4th, 1776. So it's a very timely raising of a specific ethnic battalion to join the war in anticipation of conflicts to come in New York. What I'm not going to talk about this evening, though it is certainly a topic for discussion, is the German soldiers who came with the British and fought alongside them, and some of whom decided to stay in the United States. And their stories are fascinating. But this evening, we're going to focus on the Continental Army's side of the conflict. There were men who were born in what became the United States who were involved in the Continental Army, but there were also men who were born in Europe and had military experience who came to the aid of the Continental Army. Here you can see Baron de Kalb and Baron von Steuben. De Kalb was mortally wounded during the Battle of Camden in South Carolina in 1780. And von Steuben is remembered for his professionalization of the Continental Army, especially during the winter at Valley Forge. And just to show that Germans are kind of in plain sight when we think about the founding of the United States, this is John Trumbull's painting of the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown. And you can see among the soldiers on the American side of this painting, Peter Muhlenberg and von Steuben are both sort of prominently pictured. In fact, Peter Muhlenberg is in profile, so his nose is particularly prominent in this image. But when you start looking for people of German descent in leadership roles, you start to understand the impact that they had on the success of the Continental Army, both through the professionalization that people like von Steuben brought, but also through the example of military leadership from people like Peter Muhlenberg. So we really can credit these men with the success of the Continental Army securing independence for the United States. Now, with that said, men were not the only people who took part in the Revolutionary War. If you're familiar with the legend of Molly Pitcher, it can be traced back to a German-American woman, Mary Ludwig. She was born in Trenton to Maria Margareta and Johann Georg Ludwig, and she married a soldier named William Hays and became a camp follower for the Continental Army. She was at Valley Forge in the winter of 1777 to 78 with Martha Washington and other women caring for the Continental Army soldiers. And her husband trained as an artilleryman under von Steuben's leadership. Then at the Battle of Monmouth in 1778, as the story goes, William Hays collapsed and his wife Mary took over loading the cannon for him. And as you can see from this image, this has been sort of mythologized over time. And you will often see images of a woman in a cap manning the cannon, swabbing and loading. And this is the sort of character of Molly Pitcher. This character encompassed all the women who carried water for soldiers, and that's perhaps where the pitcher in the name comes from, Molly being a nickname for Mary as well. But there was a real life Molly Pitcher. There was a real person behind that story. Part of the confusion around Mary Hays, Molly Pitcher, came from the fact that her husband, William Hays, died, and her remarried name was Macaulay. So there are records for her with multiple names, including her late husband's pension record for the Revolutionary War. But from the best accounts, it seems like we can attribute this story of someone carrying water for the Continental Army, but also stepping in to man the cannon to this particular German-American woman. Another story that takes a real German person's experience and blows it out of proportion is Christoph Scheffey. He is actually one of my ancestors. He was a fifer in a Philadelphia County battalion raised in the area where I grew up. But somehow his story got intertwined with this very famous painting, Spirit of 76, which dates to the centennial in 1876. So it's not supposed to, accurately depict something from 100 years earlier. But somehow the story of Christoph Scheffey became intertwined with the little drummer boy in this painting. And so when you look at family histories of this side of my family, they all attribute the fact that Christoph Scheffey was the inspiration for the drummer in Spirit of 1776. They have no source for it, but they all carry the same story. And this is just not factual. In the first place, he's described as a fifer, so he would have been the guy with the fife, not the drum. But more importantly, he was in his 20s, at the time that he was in this battalion. So he certainly would have not been this little boy depicted here. So these are the kinds of stories that can happen when we try to link a particular person to a particularly evocative story. But eventually we have to kind of narrow in on the historical sources and figure out what's the truth behind this story. To bring things back to reality, and in particular something material, I wanted to mention Christopher Ludwig, who is remembered as the baker general of the Continental Army. So he was supplying the army with baked goods, which would have been essential. Ludwig was born in Hesse in 1720, and he established a bakery in Philadelphia in 1754. So his reputation as a baker was pretty well established by the time he became connected with the Continental Army. These are his wooden cookie molds, which are in the collections of the Museum of the American Revolution. So although we don't have a portrait of him, we have sort of scattered records mentioning him in different letters and diaries, and of course the official records of the Continental Army. These molds give us that sense of what his day-to-day experience would have been as a baker, both before and then during the American Revolution. So that gives us our summary of the soldiers. And of course, as I mentioned, there are many, many more individuals that we could look to, and I would encourage you to add some to the chat. But let's move on now to the statesmen. And by that, I mean the men involved in drafting constitutions and establishing new governments. And of course, at this period of time, it was men. If we look later in American history, we can see women of German American backgrounds who are involved in our governments from the local level all the way up to the national level. There's a surge of women advocates for suffrage who emigrate to the US after the Revolution of 1848. So they have that revolutionary experience that's a bit different than the Revolutionary War experience. But for the period of time when we're talking about the founding of the United States, it's going to be statesmen. Just to give a few examples, at the top left, you can see John Adam Treutlen. He immigrated to Georgia when he was a child. The story of his immigration is pretty wild and involves a lot of controversy around his stepmother. But suffice to say, he becomes part of a Lutheran community in Georgia. And he actually became part of the committee that drafted Georgia's first constitution. He was also the first elected governor of Georgia right after that constitution was ratified, from May 1777 to January 1778. So he's a great example of someone establishing a political office in these Revolutionary War years. If you know anything about Georgia's leading political figures during the Revolutionary War years, you probably know that many of them met early deaths, whether by duel or getting lost at sea. And unfortunately, Treutlen is no exception. He was assassinated in 1782. The story goes that a group of men came to his home at night, and when he refused to come outside, they set the house on fire, forcing Treutlen and his family to come outside, and then they killed him in front of his family. So a pretty tragic story for this first sort of German-American governor in Georgia. Then at the bottom, I have Michael Hillegas. And he was effectively the first treasurer of the United States. He was born in Philadelphia and served for a long time in the Provincial Assembly before the Revolutionary War. He was then appointed treasurer for Pennsylvania in 1774, and then joint treasurer of the United Colonies with George Clymer in 1775. And he became the sole office holder in August 1776 after Clymer resigned and he had joined the Continental Congress and signed the Declaration of Independence. So Michael Hillegas, his title was not formally updated to Treasurer of the United States until later, but he was effectively holding that job for the entire Confederation period. And he resigned when the Treasury Department was formally established. The image you see of him here is actually from a currency note that was created with his portrait on it at the request of some of his descendants to reflect his role in the creation of the Treasury within the United States. And then we have an image here of Federal Hall in New York to draw attention to the first Congress elected after the ratification of the Constitution. 3 of the 5 representatives from Pennsylvania were German, 2 Muhlenbergs and 1 Heister. So the Muhlenbergs and the Heisters end up becoming 2 sort of political dynasties in Pennsylvania. And we see that reflected in the roster of the representatives in the first Congress. We'll get back to Friedrich Muhlenberg as Speaker of the House of Representatives in a few moments, but I just wanted to sit with this list for a moment because, again, in the newspapers in 1788, 89, there are a lot of conversations about how Pennsylvania should be represented in this new Congress. And the conversations boil down to how many Germans is too many Germans. And really, there are a lot of essays commenting on this. If we're going to have 8 representatives, can we have 2 Germans, 3, 4? What is representative of the population of Pennsylvania? And then the second layer to that is, are we okay with having 2 people from the same family as part of this German subset of the Pennsylvania delegation? And for this first election, the Congress, the representatives from Pennsylvania had at-large seats. So even though Frederick and Peter Muhlenberg lived next door to each other in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, they both were eligible for this election. So there's a lot of conversations around what it means to represent Pennsylvania, who the best representatives could be, and how German the delegation should be. And these are conversations that are happening among parties, the political parties offering up different ballots for people to vote on, but they're also happening within communities as well in ways that are not necessarily recorded in the newspapers. So we get a glimpse at the sort of conflict over who best represents Pennsylvania. And there are certainly echoes in that same conversation that happens a century later over whether Peter Muhlenberg is the best representative to be in Statuary Hall in the US Capitol. So it's a really interesting conversation. And if you ever want to dig through newspapers, it's a good episode to dig into. Now, if you took part in November's lecture on the German audience for the Declaration of Independence, you already know that the Declaration in July 1776 was quickly translated into German and printed both as a broadside and in the biweekly German newspaper in Philadelphia, the Staatsbote, which you can see here on the left. Similarly, the US Constitution was printed in German in 1787. This example is a Lancaster newspaper that was printed September 26th, 1787. And the Constitution took up almost the entire 4-page newspaper. So, of course, the Constitution is a much longer document than the Declaration of Independence. You can see the first paragraph under the word convention. That's the preamble that we know so well. This is a particularly interesting example of a printing of the Constitution in German because, as you can see in the top right corner, this is only the 8th issue of this particular newspaper. So that means that the printers, and there were a couple of printers working on this paper, they recognized the need for a new newspaper in Lancaster, Pennsylvania at this moment of Constitution crafting. And we see the same thing in 1776, where communities recognize a need for a newspaper at a moment of political developments. But by 1787, there are more opportunities for other non-English language newspapers, including this German one. Something you may not know about the Constitution, and certainly German Americans did not know in 1787, is that the scribe of the Constitution was German. It was a clerk named Jacob Schalus. That's his handwriting on the parchment copy of the Constitution, which is in the rotunda of the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Schalus was born in 1750, a year after his parents, Frederica and Valentine Schalus, immigrated from the Palatinate, so he was born here. And he was assistant clerk to the Pennsylvania Assembly at the time of the Constitutional Convention. So it seems as though someone identified that he had, clear handwriting, the same way that Timothy Matlack was identified in 1776 to be the scribe for the parchment copy of the Declaration of Independence. Matlack's handwriting to me is a little bit clearer than Schalus's, but Schalus had the more challenging job of a longer document. And of course, his choice in the top right corner of this parchment for "We the People" has become so iconic. You see that exact handwriting reprinted on t-shirts and book covers and as graphics, especially during the 250th. We see "We the People" everywhere. So that is the mark of a German American directly on the founding of the United States. But it wasn't known at the time that Schalus was the engrosser of the Constitution. That work was done later to kind of compare and look at receipts and try to figure out whose handwriting it really was. So his job was, overlooked, but we can certainly look back and recognize him in the same way that people have celebrated Timothy Matlack as the scribe of the Declaration. So that covers the soldiers, the statesmen, and now I wanted to get into the family that represents both of those trajectories when it comes to the founding of the United States. I've been mentioning the Muhlenbergs all along, but it's time to get into a bit more detail. I've been working at Historic Trappe for the past 2 years, and Historic Trappe includes the homes of the Muhlenberg family. The family's first home in Trappe, when Henry Melchior Muhlenberg comes to Trappe and establishes Augustus Lutheran Church, becomes the minister there, and has his family with his wife Anna Maria. So we have the sort of homestead where most of the Muhlenberg children were born. Then right down the street is the Henry Muhlenberg house, which is where the family moved in 1776, literally a week after the Declaration of Independence, because it was no longer safe to be in Philadelphia or in New York, which was where Friedrich Muhlenberg was with his family. And then just down the block from that is Frederick Muhlenberg's house, which we call the Speaker's house because of his role as Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. So these were the houses where Peter Muhlenberg and Friedrich Muhlenberg were living in the post-war years. And coincidentally, this is the same area that I grew up in. I've driven past these homes my whole life and never really understood the significance of them. So the way that we've been thinking about Historic Trappe's impact as we mark the 250th of the United States is that this is, a founding family in our backyard, a family that gets overlooked oftentimes, but really is representative of all of the political developments that are happening during the years of the Revolutionary War. To start with Peter Muhlenberg, he was educated at Halle with his brothers, but proved to be a bit of a rebel and not quite inclined to that academic life. So he left to join the military, and it was that experience which sort of primed him for his later career in the Revolutionary War. He was Lutheran like his father and his brothers, but he was ordained in the Church of England so that he could lead a congregation in Virginia, where the Anglican Church ruled all. So during the Revolutionary War, he began as a commander in Virginia. He had served in the House of Burgesses. Then he had torn off his robe to reveal his military uniform underneath and begun recruiting mostly German people from the area around his church in Woodstock. And so he was, at first an officer representing Virginians. Eventually, he rises through the ranks. So that's where that controversy around whether he was really a Virginian or really a Pennsylvanian comes into play. But after the war, he joined the State Society of the Cincinnati for Pennsylvania. So we know where he thought he stood. And you can see him here painted by John Trumbull in his military uniform. Peter was elected to the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania, which was this weird sort of government structure that was set up in the radical Constitution of 1776 for Pennsylvania. And he became vice president of the Executive Council. And as vice president, he was part of this grand procession that took place on July 4th, 1788, celebrating the Constitution. He was on horseback and he was carrying a blue flag with silver letters with the date September 17, 1787, which is the date that the Constitution was agreed upon and signed. Then Peter was elected alongside his brother to the first Congress, member of the House of Representatives representing Pennsylvania. And he holds and tries to hold various political positions for the rest of his life. He's also, along with his brothers, involved with the German Society of Pennsylvania, of course. The last political position he held at the time of his death was customs collector for Philadelphia. So Peter's political career is not quite as recognized as his military career, and in particular, that moment of him disrobing and choosing to leave the pulpit to join the military. That's what has been depicted over and over and over. That's what all the statues of him look like. But really, he had a much more complex career than just that particular moment in January 1776. And I think certainly is a good representative for Pennsylvania. So I'm cool with his statue being in Statuary Hall. Now, his brother, Friedrich Muhlenberg, is a legitimate founder of the United States who does not get included in the same conversations as John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton. Friedrich Muhlenberg was the first Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. That's a position that he held for multiple terms. And so he essentially established what it meant to be Speaker of the House. And I like to think back to July 2nd, 1776, when Friedrich Muhlenberg arrived in Philadelphia because he could no longer be in New York. He had been leading a Lutheran congregation in New York City. It was no longer safe. There was a fear of an imminent British attack. So he evacuates his family and they come back to Philadelphia, back to Pennsylvania. And he arrives in Philadelphia on July 2nd, the same day that the Continental Congress agreed to declare independence from Great Britain. And I wonder at that particular moment if he recognized how much his life was going to change and how different his career was going to be than what he had been trained for, which was to be a Lutheran minister. Friedrich Muhlenberg has some tense interactions with his brother through letters and also kind of corresponding with other family members about Peter's decision to leave the pulpit for the military. Frederick doesn't agree with it. He doesn't understand it. But ultimately, Frederick does similarly leave the pulpit. He leaves it for politics. And his decision is something his father does not understand, and writes in his diary about all the different political positions that Frederick held, and how he was just descending deeper and deeper into this terrible misery of politics. But Friedrich Muhlenberg is a really interesting political figure. It's possible that he was elevated to the positions that he held because of his experience as a minister, being someone who was a trusted authority figure, who was comfortable speaking to crowds. We don't know for sure. But the first political position that he holds is just after the British evacuation of Philadelphia, when he is a member of the Pennsylvania Assembly and becomes speaker. That's his first speakership. He then is in the chair of the ratifying convention for the Constitution in Pennsylvania. And then, of course, he's elected to the first Congress. In between all of these positions at these sort of higher levels with, a really significant impact, Frederick Muhlenberg is also involved in the establishment of a new county in Pennsylvania, the splitting apart of Philadelphia County to create Montgomery County, named for Richard Montgomery. And Frederick Muhlenberg holds a variety of positions at the county level. To list some of them off, he was president of the Pennsylvania Council of Censors. He was delegate to the ratifying convention. Those are all things happening in Philadelphia. But at the same time, he was the receiver of deeds. He was responsible for court sessions that were happening in Montgomery County. He was involved in all of these sort of establishing of county procedures. So he's splitting his time between going to Philadelphia and coming back to Trappe. And it's a drive that is not fun to do today down the Schuylkill Expressway. But in the 1780s, it would have required fording multiple creeks to get to Philadelphia from Trappe. So he really had this interest in kind of bouncing back and forth between these different political roles and being a resource for people in his community to bring their wills to be recorded, to have local court sessions. The first orphans court in Montgomery County was held in his house in Trappe before there was a county seat formally established. So this moment really, to me, establishes Frederick Muhlenberg as a founder even before he becomes the first Speaker of the U.S. House. In that role as Speaker of the House, he's involved in a lot of the first decisions that are being made by the federal legislature. He is involved in some unpopular decisions after he is no longer Speaker and casts a deciding vote for the Jay Treaty. He's actually stabbed by his brother-in-law. So he really goes through the ringer in professional politics. His last position that he held was as Receiver General of the Pennsylvania Land Office. And at that time, he needed to be in Lancaster, Pennsylvania to do that job. So that's where he ultimately passes away. But his career is just a really interesting examination of all of the different things required to establish a new nation, right? When you declare independence from British rule, it means you have to fill that vacuum with governance from the local level all the way up to the national level. And Frederick Muhlenberg is a part of that process, more so than almost anyone else I could identify. And if we're giving Frederick his due, we also have to give his wife, Catherine Muhlenberg, her due. Catherine is a really interesting figure. You can see here, this is a painting of her that is a pair to her husband's from the time when he was Speaker of the House. This was painted in New York by Joseph Wright. This painting was thought to have been lost, but was located by my colleague Lisa Minardi in the attic of a Muhlenberg descendant's home. Catherine Muhlenberg would have been the hostess for all of the things required of Frederick Muhlenberg's politics. So if we think about her experience as a woman at the founding of the United States, we get a glimpse into the experience of other high-profile women who were responsible for, being hospitable to people who were coming to either court meetings or having a meal with her husbands, the sort of elite kind of, teas and drinks that were happening. She was responsible for that side of things. And so as Frederick's political career was advancing and accelerating, so too were Catherine's responsibilities. And when we look at their home in Trappe, Pennsylvania, this is the reconstructed home today. The front portion of the house looks as it would have at the time that Catherine and Frederick lived there. The front of the house has this large room where you can imagine there would have been a big table, and it would have been the place to host multiple people at once. And so that side of things would have been Catherine's domain. And I think we often forget about the wives of the people who were involved in the founding of the United States. Oftentimes their side of correspondence is lost. We only have the men's perspective. But in Catherine's case, it's really important to remember the sacrifices that women made as their husbands were establishing all of these political precedents and making the connections that were necessary to ensure the success of the independent United States. To give a plug, the Speaker's house, Frederick and Catherine Muhlenberg's home, will be opening to the public in just a couple of weeks. We will have a dedication weekend, April 11th and 12th. This home has undergone 25 years of community-led restoration. It was supposed to be turned into a CVS 25 years ago. And instead, to mark the 250th, we're getting ready to open it as a fully restored space that interprets the lives of Friedrich and Catherine Muhlenberg at the time that Frederick was holding all of these different political positions. And it's really going to become a center for civic education that I think is deserving of Frederick's legacy as one of these German Americans that was intimately involved with the founding of the United States. So if you're planning to visit the Philadelphia area, or if you live in this area, I would encourage you to come out to Trappe beginning this April, but anytime after the home is formally opened. And then if you do come to Trappe, you'll get to see the special exhibition that I've been working on with my colleagues called Window to Revolution, Pennsylvania Germans and the War for Independence. And it highlights some of these same people who I've been talking about, as well as the sort of German audience for the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, and the establishment of the United States. And the image you see here is a fractor that's going to be on loan from Independence National Historical Park. And this is George Washington. And I love this image because it so clearly represents a distinct German perspective on the founding of the United States. That does not look like George Washington when you compare it to other portraits and engravings that were made of him at the time that he was alive and have been made of him since. But it so clearly gives you an understanding of how German Americans thought about the founding of the United States, the key people in it, and how they infused that perspective with their own perspective. So I encourage you to come out. Window to Revolution will be up for a long time because we're marking the long 250th, commemorating when the war came to the greater Philadelphia area in the fall of 1777, leading up to the encampment at Valley Forge. So you have plenty of time to come visit the Center for Pennsylvania German Studies at Historic Trappe. And with that, I'm concluding our exploration of German Americans at the founding of the United States. As I said, this is only a glimpse at the many people who were involved in the establishment of this nation, in winning the war for independence, but also in securing the rights of the people that we hold so dearly today. And so I hope that this gives a sense of how these people have been overlooked, and also how, as we approach the 250th of all of these important anniversaries, we can work to surface the experience of German Americans and make sure that their voices are heard once again. Thank you so much, and I'm going to hand things over to Bettina and Jana for the chat.
Thank you so much, Emily. So yeah, I encourage everyone to ask questions and put them in the chat before they crumble in, so to speak. I take the opportunity and also ask you a question, Emily, particularly because you said that in the beginning, you know, with like John Adams specifically blaming the German Americans for his loss. They're ignorant of our language, our laws. So could you maybe elaborate a little bit more exactly on the impact of language, that they had among the soldiers, but then also among the politicians? Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's this ongoing conversation about whether ethnically German people should continue speaking German and using that as their sort of everyday operating language, or if they should learn English. And this is a conversation that has happened across the generations among different immigrant communities. But at the founding, it really is focused on Germans. And there's different perspectives. At sometimes the ability for people to communicate in German is almost weaponized, especially when German soldiers fighting for the British come here, and there are broadsides and handbills printed in German encouraging German Americans to talk to these soldiers and maybe convince them to stay in the United States. There's also moments where people are really critiqued and almost demonized for continuing to speak German. And then, of course, there's really this controversy over the national language, which Friedrich Muhlenberg is kind of remembered as being a key figure in this controversy. What it actually boils down to is a much simpler case of a petition from a German-speaking community in Virginia asking for the federal laws to be printed in German as well as English, something that was happening kind of, informally already with so many German newspapers and pamphlets and things. But the vote on whether or not to consider that proposal has been, misremembered and distorted as a vote over whether German should be the national language. So really, there's these sort of things that actually happened and then stories that get spun off from it that change our perspective on people like Friedrich Muhlenberg. So I love the fact that people continued to live their day-to-day lives in German, that we have German newspapers and things, letters that are written in German between family members. I think it's a great way of understanding how these immigrant communities actually functioned, regardless of whatever laws were in place.
Right. Thanks. I will ask the first question I see here. Have you given tours of the Augustus Church in Trappe? Or do they give tours?
I know Augustus Church well. It's a wonderful space. It's actually where my family goes on Christmas Eve because they have candlelight services in the old church. But they have their own staff members who give tours. So if you do come to the Trappe area and you want to get a tour of Augustus Church, you have to get in touch with their church office to schedule a tour there.
Great.
Bettina, do you also want to ask the next one?
Sure. Okay, next question. Are you aware of any connections between the early German Americans and the Articles of Confederation?
That's a good question. I can't think of any off the top of my head, except that I know that the American Philosophical Society has one of Francis Bailey's printings of the Articles of Confederation that was owned by Michael Hillegas. So there's at least a material connection to someone.
Next one I'm going to read out. So basically, the first one is a comment and the other one is a question. The comment, or I guess just a note is like, I believe George Washington's funeral was held in a German church to St. Michael and Sion in Philadelphia because it was the largest church in the city. And then the question from another person, were there Germans who remained loyal to the crown? Which I guess also it's interesting because you talked about the political diversities also among the German Americans.
Yeah. So on Washington's funeral, yes, there was a service that was held at St. Michael's in Zion because it was a very large church that could hold the crowd of several hundred people. Now, it's important to remember that Washington died in Mount Vernon. So it was not as if his body was lying in state at this church. This was just an opportunity for the federal government, for all of the people living in Philadelphia to recognize the death of Washington, and they chose that venue. As for Germans' loyalty to the crown, it's a really complex question. There were certainly German Americans who would have preferred for the colonies to reconcile with Great Britain. There were also German Americans who, especially for religious reasons, wanted to remain neutral in the conflict and just continue living their lives and not be forced to take a side. And then you have German Americans who, are joining the Continental Army and are excited to fight for independence. So there's this whole spectrum. But in terms of loyalty, it's complicated a bit by the additional fact that the Georgian kings are themselves German. And so there's a perception that people who are ethnically German might be even more inclined to remain loyal to King George III because of that ethnic connection. Even when the Philadelphia campaign is happening and there's wars in the Trappe area, Henry Muhlenberg is worried for his life because he doesn't want to take a particular side in the conflict, even though his sons are both clearly on one side. And he's questioning whether it would be safer for him to stay in Trappe or not. And his children are actually encouraging him to go to British-occupied Philadelphia to seek safety. So people had all different perspectives based on different personal factors. And then there's also this external perception of how Germans must feel politically that continues through independence.
Interesting. Okay, next question regarding Frederick Muhlenberg as the first Speaker of the House. James Madison often seems to overshadow him in terms of activity in the early House of Representatives. Do you have any idea why that
Any
is?
idea why that is? I don't know. No, it's a good question. Yeah, I think this is one of the reasons why the fact that Friedrich Muhlenberg is overlooked is so frustrating, because there are senators and members of the House of Representatives who are more thought of when we think of the first Congress than the Speaker himself. And certainly we know today from how the Speaker of the House operates, there's a limit to how much involvement they have in terms of actual votes and things. James Madison is really documenting his own political career, so that could be a factor as well. But yeah, it does seem a bit odd that Frederick gets so overshadowed by Madison and other people in the first Congress as well.
Emily, told us in the beginning, right? There are so many different individuals who were involved. So there's a question whether you know somebody named Daniel Heister.
I do. Yeah, I know the Heisters. Daniel Heister was in the first Congress with Frederick and Peter Muhlenberg. The Heister family, similarly to the Muhlenberg family, has multiple generations that are serving in different political roles. Daniel Heister, in particular, if I remember correctly, marries into another German family. So there's certain votes that he's involved in that are particularly interesting. Same with the Peter Muhlenberg. If I remember correctly, Daniel Heister was on the committee to consider that proposal of whether to print the laws in the German language. So definitely, if you start looking at the annals of Congress, you can just Control F, look for people's names and see what exactly they're involved in.
Great. Okay, you answered the question about the national language, so I'm skipping that one. Next question. That you make a great case for a visit to Trappe, and how long should someone set aside to visit the sites there?
Good. I've done my job.
Yes.
I would say at least half a day. It takes a bit of time to go through each of the houses, and then our museum is in a historic tavern, so there's a few different galleries in there for our special exhibit. And I failed to mention that as part of Window to Revolution, we're having Neil Hurst, who is an expert in historic costuming at Colonial Williamsburg, recreate Peter Muhlenberg's uniform and robe so that we can have that on a mannequin alongside other objects from that area of Virginia around his church in Woodstock. So definitely worth at least half a day, if not a full day. We're also only about 20 minutes from Valley Forge, so that creates a nice one-day experience if you'd like.
I'm also going to put the next two together because they are both of them asking more about data, specific data about the events. So first of all, how many Germans served in the regular Continental Army infantry besides Steuben? And what is the actual date the Declaration of Independence was printed in a German American or in a German newspaper?
Sure. So I don't know the exact number of Germans in the entire Continental Army over the course of the war. What I can say is there were multiple, almost entirely German battalions. So you can kind of add those up, and then there would have been other, individuals who were in other positions within the military. So definitely a lot of people, but I don't have the exact number. And then in terms of the declaration in the Staatsbote, that was on July 9th. So 5 days after the Continental Congress approved the text.
Okay, here's a question. I guess this is probably from a descendant because the name is the same. Have you run across information on the Marsteller family who are co-founders of the church? I guess
yes, the Marstellers are one of the founding families of Trappe, and we've actually been doing some research on different Marstellers who served in the Revolutionary War and then who are artisans as well. So the Marstellers will be represented in Historic Trappe's upcoming exhibition.
Yeah, and the next rather comment than question also gives us a little bit more like insights into family history, saying our Merkel line, some of them stayed loyal and ended up in Canada. The next question, again, like which focuses much on the diversity aspect of German Americans, which were the largest, most prominent groups? Did they even think of themselves as German Americans, or was not confession more significant?
That's a really interesting question, and I think it's hard to answer in the context of so much exterior perspective being documented. So people commenting on Germans as if they are one collective group, more so than people who are German American themselves commenting on how they see their perspective. So I think it's hard to tell. I think there are certain communities that are more insular, whether that's because they have a particular religion or because they're located in a particular area that is cut off from, not as close to the urban centers or whatever. But yeah, I think that's a question worth thinking about, whether they themselves, as their primary identity, thought of themselves through their Germanness or through other factors like their religion, their career, who they were connected to, who their families were intermarried with. Hard to answer.
Okay, I'm going to skip a comment. And next question I see about von Steuben. Do you have any idea where his personal papers or uniforms, etc., are housed?
That
I am not sure about. No.
Yeah, interesting.
And
okay,
I should say, I did see the other comment, and I failed to mention, yes, Friedrich Muhlenberg signed the Bill of Rights. That is one of his sort of more prominent visuals of his impact at the founding.
Then the next question is, did many German soldiers serving the British, so such as the Hessians, for instance, choose to stay in the US following the war? Indeed, was this even possible?
It was possible, and there is a fair number of men that we can point to, especially in Pennsylvania. At Historic Trappe in particular, we are highlighting the soldiers who became fracture artists, and there's a fair number of them. And so their particular experiences impact the things they create. And so we wanted to highlight their examples of their fracture in our upcoming exhibition. So yes, it was definitely possible. And there were a pretty decent number who stayed either because of the opportunities for land, for rights, or because they had, found an opportunity to have a family here, all sorts of opportunities. And that experience complicates our understanding of mercenaries, of soldiers that are paid to go somewhere, that they were not necessarily loyal to the British side of the war. They were thinking about their own interests as well.
Okay. Next question. Do you know anything about the Gunwad Bible?
Yes. So the Gunwad Bible is remembered that way because it was a Bible printed by Christopher Sauer in Germantown. And the story goes that the unbound pages of this Bible printed in 1776 were used as gun wadding. That, by that time in the Revolutionary War, paper was at a premium. And so you're using whatever you could. And both Sauer's printing office was raided by the military, as was Henry Miller's office in Philadelphia when the British occupied the city. So printers who had both sort of political perspectives, Sauer was more loyalist, Miller was more on the patriot side, ended up having to sort of deal with the physical damage to their printed works and their printing offices. So yes, the Gunwad Bible is pretty well known by that name, but it is printed by Christopher Sauer in 1776.
We have one at the German Society.
Yes, you do.
And the other two as well.
Which means you should come to the German Society and have a look
Yes.
at those.
That's right.
The next question, which I particularly like, is, are there any other notable German women during this time period that you didn't get time to talk about but would like to?
That's a great question. Not that I was searching for women, but I think the women of German descent are a little bit harder to track because, typically they're remembered by their married name. And so you have to think about how different communities operated and how families were intermarrying with each other. There's no particular names that come to mind, but I will say that all of the Muhlenberg women are interesting in their own right. And typically the focus is on the three men, Frederick, Peter, and their brother, Henry. But the Muhlenberg women each had really unique experiences of the Revolutionary War. The youngest was only 10 years old at the start of the war, and by the end of the war, she was married. One of the Muhlenberg daughters lived in British-occupied Philadelphia and was a sort of hostess for some of the Hessian officers who were in the city at that time. So those are the women that I probably would have talked about just because I'm the most familiar with them, but I'm sure there are many, many more.
Okay, we might have time for just one or two more questions. I'll just go to the next one. How did other Anglo founders view the Muhlenbergs? Did they see them as equivalent to themselves? Did the othering of Germans as a political community rub off on how Anglo founders viewed them? For instance, did John Adams comment about Germans apply to the Muhlenbergs, or are they an exception?
That's a great question. I think there is a certain amount of treating the Muhlenbergs as different in both positive and negative ways. The positive way would be that there was tremendous respect for Henry Muhlenberg, the father, as the sort of founder of the Lutheran Church in the colonies turned United States. So I think there's a little bit of nepotism at play in transferring that respect that's held for him onto his children. The flip side of that is, yes, I do think that the Muhlenbergs were treated slightly differently, described differently, not in sort of open xenophobia, but just in the ways that they might be influenced by the needs of German Americans, or that German Americans might be particularly inclined to vote for them. And it's the same sort of conversations that pop up around the possibility of, a Catholic president with JFK, a Jewish president, a female president. It's those kinds of undertones of othering that you see in conversations around, well, did they really deserve this political office, or was it only because they were German? So that also continues through the subsequent generations of Muhlenbergs who also hold political office. So they become this kind of dynasty And each generation is dealing with that perception of why people are really supporting them.
I'm trying, given that we're kind of running out of time, I'm trying to at least give you the two next questions, and then you decide, Emily, if you have time to basically answer both of them. Thanks for answering my question. I didn't know there were full German battalions, something I thought of you after you answered my question. Washington gave Hessians farms for simply defecting from the British Army. Were there hard feelings between those and then the others who kind of served honestly in the German battalions? And the other question, which I found very funny, is what about the OG Germans, the descendants of the Krefeld Germantown 1683 13 Families group? What was their role basically in 1776?
Great questions. So first, in terms of how people might have felt about the German soldiers who fought with the British versus German people who fought on the Continental Army side, it's really hard to tell. In a lot of cases, these particular people did not leave behind written records that might reflect those feelings of jealousy or not really understanding the other side of the conflict. So I can't give a clear answer or a particular example. For the OG Germans, I will admit I thought about starting in 1688 with the first anti-slavery petition, which the city of Philadelphia will be marking in a couple of weeks in Germantown as part of their 52 weeks of firsts. But yes, there are these original families in Germantown. I'm descended from one of them, and they, by and large, still live in the greater Philadelphia area in 1776. A lot of their descendants intermarry with each other, and they're still living in Germantown or the surrounding area. That doesn't mean that they are in support of independence. In my particular line, which is descended from the Kunders family, the name gets warped a little bit, and there's a Connard who is living in the greater Philadelphia area who definitely does not support independence. So I think the same as everywhere else, the first immigrants to this area, over time, families are split by political decisions. So there's no one answer to what the descendants of the 13 families were doing in 1776.
That might be all we have time for, because I see Antje is back.
Maybe that's a good point to jump back in. I want to thank you, Emily, for a really very interesting, fascinating presentation. I learned a lot, and thank you, Jana and Bettina, for moderating, and thank you, this wonderful audience, and all those great questions. I will pass on the questions to Emily that we couldn't cover tonight, and I also want to reiterate that this talk was taped and it will show up on our YouTube channel in about a week or so. I also want to point out that there are two more talks on our YouTube channel that deal with German Americans and the revolutionary period. One is Emily Sneff's talk she gave in November on the German audience for the US Declaration of Independence. And the other one is a talk by Professor Friedrich on the Hessians, so those German soldiers in the American Revolutionary War that came as fighting for the British. So those are great presentations. I invite you to watch those and other things. And thank you, and hope to see you at some of our other events. Good night.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right.